Thank you so very much for the wonderful introduction, and thank you for having me here. So, why would a German living in Austria go to Sweden to talk about playing an Englishman in a video game? When I finished my dissertation in the end of last year, in which I tried to come up with a definition of what a video game experience actually is, I ended up with two very important follow-up conclusions. Firstly, that we can never separate the personal experience from our cultural belonging. And secondly, that I really want to talk more about a video game called Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, which is a lovely walking simulator by the Brighton-based development studio, The Chinese Room. And yeah, we're going to approach it later on in that presentation a bit more. And specifically, there was one review on Games Reader by one Matthew Elliott that inspired me to talk more about this video game. Matthew Elliott is a self-declared Englishman, and he basically wrote a review in which an Englishman explains why the video game is so British. And of course, he talks about the lush landscapes, he talks about architecture in the video game, but there's one statement that specifically struck a chord with me, namely that English people can't run. Or as he continues with it, I mean, we can run, but we usually choose not to. And that's something that I didn't notice about the video game before until after I read that review. But it's a walking simulator, so you have a very slow pace when you're walking, when you're moving around. There's one button with which you can uncomfortably wiggle a bit more and a little bit faster around, which I guess is his definition of an Englishman running. But that's about it. It's all very slow paced, all quite meditative. And this is actually a very nuanced mechanical feature that encourages us to explore the virtual world of Everybody's Gone to the Rapture at its own aesthetic terms, so to speak. And therefore, it encourages us to ask, in how far do we as players become or role play an English flaneur in a walking simulator? And in order to elaborate that thought to you, I'm at first going to talk about walking simulators in general before trying to decipher them as being part walking and that walking taking place in a video game. Afterwards, we're going to talk about Englishness, or at least we're going to try to, before moving on to a chat about Everybody's Gone to the Rapture and how it is a very quintessentially English video game. And finally, we're going towards some open questions that I would love to discuss with you guys later on over a cup of coffee, preferably. Walking simulators since the early 2010s, apologies, are a genre that has earned quite a bit of a notoriety. To those of you who haven't played walking simulators before, usually we're speaking about rather short video games, slow-paced video games that are more or less defined by the idea of being challengeless. So there's no time limits, there's rarely enemies, there's rarely any sorts of puzzles or obstacles. It's really all about walking around and taking in a virtual environment. Or as Keogh put it, they are a genre that we can define as being explicit in an attempt at mechanical minimalism. As such, social media, news outlets, and academic fields alike have come up with very essential questions about this sort of essentially condensed video game genre. News outlets especially focused on the question if walking simulators are video games at all, or if we're talking about a different kind of media phenomenon here. Other academic resources have, for example, asked questions such as, what is the aesthetic effect of mechanic minimalism in a video game, as done by Zimmerman and Huberts, for example, or by Moralde? Why is this minimalist state capable of putting us in touch with the extraordinary, here in the sense of an extraordinary experience that would go beyond the positivist scope of experiences, so emotional experiences, religious experiences, experiences of beauty, for example, as asked by Ruberg? And how do they encourage us to reevaluate interdisciplinarity in game studies, as wonderfully done by Rosa Carbo-Mascarell, who tried to introduce the psychogeographical vocabulary in order to describe walking as a phenomenon in video games. Moreover, though, walking simulators really encourage us to focus on one central quality of the video game, namely that of a personal experience being made by interacting with them. And by walking in a video game, for example, as Melissa Kagan puts it, we can ask ourselves, how does this experience of walking then tap into cultural narratives, and which ones precisely? Walking is a or solitary walking explicitly is something rather unique in many, many cultures, especially across Central European cultures. And therefore, we can never separate the act of solitary walking truly from being part of this cultural embeddedness. For now, we can arrive at the interim conclusion of calling walking simulators as provisioners of a condensed take at what I want to call play walking for the time being. Now, as already said, the concept of solitary walking and gaining unique experiences by doing so is a tradition of that we can find in our history from antiquity to meta-modernity even. By now, the idea of the Greek philosopher with his long white beard walking up and down in order to arrive at a specific thought has been debunked as a myth. Nevertheless, our cultural narratives, both fictional and historical, are filled with the tales of shepherds, wanderers, pilgrims, or urban explorers, for example. Rebecca Solnit expresses it by stating, walking is a state in which mind, the body, and the world are aligned, as though they were three characters finally in conversation together. This already points us to the fact that with regards to solitary walking, there's always a very distinct sensitivity connected to it, a sensitivity to our own meaning and importance in the surroundings that we explore while wandering around. And we can even call that relation a playful one, according to Francesco Carreri, for example, who compares the wanderer to the Homo ludens, the idea of the playful human being. So the solitary wanderer walking around and basically discovering the atmosphere or the feeling of a place according to its own rules, and of course, according to their meaning and physical presence in that room that they are interacting with, in that space that they're interacting with. Therefore, solitary walking has turned into a sort of a tool of self-exploration, but with that self-exploration, there's always the connection to the exploration of a locally unique mood or ambience, as done, for example, by the situationist movement in 1950s and 1960s Paris. And therefore, we can actually say that solitary walking has a lot in common with the idea of playing a game or role-playing in a game specifically. Johann Hausmacher said that the play character may attach to the sublimest forms of action. So just as in solitary walking, we are entering a different state of mind where we are discovering the ordinary by its own fantastic and magical rules, ideas, concept, and storylines, cultural narratives that we attach to it, but also that we derive from it. And at the core of proper game design, there's always the idea of creating a meaningful experience that we can find in handbooks ranging from Jesse Schell up to Tin and Sylvester, for example. And if we arrive at the conclusion that the video game experience is a self-orchestrated, self-contemplated, and self-motivated or self-mediated liaison with a tangibly virtual construct, so us being in a virtual world and playing the video game, we arrive at the conclusion that the video game in itself is a sort of liminal state in between the ideas of role-playing as being there, because we are immersed in that virtual world, combined with the act of des sich selbst durchspielens, as German philosopher and game studies scholar Daniel Martin Feige called it. So the idea of playing through yourself. We enter a video game, we take something from that virtual world, but also us being there makes us reflect upon ourselves, upon our actions, upon how we interact with that video game, for example. Now, how does Englishness or culture in general play into all of this? Culture and identifying culture, as you may have noticed, is something rather complex and difficult. It's tremendously complex when we try to figure out our own identity in culture, but it gets even more complicated when we enter a more abstract level about how culture functions. I brought a little map with me that kind of encapsulates several ideas and key terms that we may or may not know about Englishness, Britishness, and so on and so forth. So we got Great Britain, which is, of course, something different than the British Isles, which is something different, but maybe not so different from Ireland and Northern Ireland, and there's Scotland, England, Wales in there. So this is just to emphasize and to show you that the idea of Englishness or Britishness that we may approach with concepts such as the imagined community by Anderson does, of course, have a meaning to us, but it's all a very contested field. It's all a rather clubustery field of different terms relating to one another, fluctuating into one another, or being in collision with one another. Throughout my presentation, you may have noticed I kind of mixed in between Englishness and Britishness. If I forgot about it, I must apologize. I really wanted to confuse you at that point because this is confusing, and I really want to make a point about how confusing this can actually be. What we do have, however, thank you very much. What we do have, however, is, of course, the knowledge that we are all embedded into these artificial constructs of culture. We cannot really escape that. And therefore, we have a plethora of texts trying to describe these more or less national cultures to us. So, for example, when we take a look at literature focused on walking and its meaning as an English tradition, we find texts that elaborate in how far walking for the English people can be seen as a connection to Romanticism. There's also a large tradition of walking through landscape gardens in England, for example, up to more recent theories describing walking as a part of a sort of new antiquarianism. So the idea that a place always radiates culture towards us, and we kind of take up on that as we enter and walk through a place. And that can range from walking through a London city street and knowing about its historical relevance to walking through a London city street and recalling, hey, I've seen that on Sherlock. And so it's really cool to be here right now. And of course, we also do have texts talking about how we could potentially define Britishness or Englishness in video games. For example, from Nick Webber from the Birmingham City University, who explored several ways in which we could describe a video game as English or British, for example, by taking a look at the cultural test, which is a test by the British government by which it is decided how much funding a British local video game would get, for example. But he also states that the agency granted to players by games allows them, in effect, to perform Britishness themselves, offering a more nuanced and complex engagement with ideas of national identity than that possible through film. Or, in other words, the English don't run is not a self-aware joke by a so-called Englishman about other so-called Englishmen for readers who may or may not define themselves as Englishmen or English people. It's a very astute observation about how very minimalistic design choices can actually, and maybe even without us even noticing, encourage us to engage with exploring a different culture or role-playing a different culture kind of automatically by playing a video game. And this is what wonderfully happens in the walking simulators by the Chinese Room. They have released 3 rather important walking simulators between the years 2012 and 2015. The first and most renowned one potentially being Dear Esther, followed by Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, which kind of combines walking simulators with survival horror, which is really cool and a really astute observation about the horrors of industrialized London or London during the industrialization. And of course, Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, released in 2015, which I just want to take out as an example for one of these quintessentially British walking simulators. Because what Everybody's Gone to the Rapture does is that it provides us with a virtual landscape inspired by English Romanticism, as you can see from the screenshot, which is basically the introductory cutscene of the video game, taking us right into the gameplay. This is where we start the game, taking a look at Shropshire Village, which is in England, but close to the border of Wales, where we as players immerse in microcosmos of local ambience. We can visit a pub. We learn a lot about the people who inhabited that place and all the kinds of, everyday cultural interactions they had with one another. We are also touching on leitmotifs of British history and cultural tropes. You may not recognize it from the screenshots, but this is actually a post-apocalyptic game. But we are in a very specific type of post-apocalypse, typical to English narratives, namely the so-called cozy apocalypse, where everything is, all the bad things have happened already, and now it's just lush nature, pastoral, watching the last sunset together, motifs like that. So it's tragic but beautiful at the same time. It's also encouraging us to walk in awe and contemplation, as is expected of the English flaneur. We're not there to run. We can't run, quite literally, but we're there to enjoy the landscape. And therefore, the game is also laying ground for British ideas of high concept experiences, such as a very British take on transcendence and spiritual belonging. We don't have enough crayons and slides for that, but we can gladly talk about this later on during a coffee break, for example. However, I want to conclude this presentation with a couple of follow-up questions, because now that we arrived at the thought that, yes, we are potentially role-playing an aspect of British culture by engaging with a video game like that, there's of course more questions. More questions are always awesome. So the first follow-up question I want to introduce is the question of role play, because many of us will know role playing, LARPing, pen and paper playing as a multiplayer aspect. We're doing these things together with other people. So can we actually call this role playing? Because what we actually try to reenact is something that is solitary by definition. This is not about walking together with people, but about being for yourself in order to reach that contemplative mode when being in an environment. The second follow-up question would be the question of Anglophilia, because what we have with a game like Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, for example, is maybe not a typical or ordinary British experience, if we can even call something like that a British experience, but it's something extremely condensed, combining aspects of everyday life together with architecture, nature, LARPing, British fiction. Thank you. So is it something more? Is it something much more condensed? And is this something that we actually crave for, or that perhaps an English person would crave for in the age of Brexit? And finally, the question of personal cultural experience, because again, the video game experience is a self-contemplated, self-orchestrated, and self-mediated experience. So we might have developers who come from Britain who may want to purposefully make a British video game, but that's just one half of it, because a video game is built on interaction. So how much Britishness would be left there if it's played by a German person living in Austria on a Japanese console, going to Sweden to talk about it? Thank you.